Okay. Well, we're all thrilled to have y'all join us today for our first episode of the Workplace Science Explained. This is the first in a series that's designed to take the science and data of the workplace, and we're going to break it down and present it to the HR professionals, HR leaders, safety leaders, and other leaders that join us to get into the science of this stuff. Our goal is to take the complex data and ideas and break them down into understandable and actionable steps. We do the research, you get the knowledge. So just think of us as your nerdy friend in school that lets you copy their homework. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to our chief nerd, aka the CEO of Pixel Leadership Group, Dr. Jamie Lewis-Smith.
Thank you very much, Brett. So as he said, I'm Jamie Lewis-Smith, the CEO of Pixel Leadership Group. We appreciate you all joining us, and I am very proud of my nerd status. So I think hopefully you all will come along on this journey with me to geek out on some data today about psychological safety. Just a little bit about who we are, what we are at Pixel. We help organizations create empowered cultures, and we do that by helping you to understand and leverage behavioral science so that you can make good decisions and take action to engage and retain your employees. And as Brett alluded to, we like to think of ourselves as nerdy but fun. So we are science nerds, data geeks at heart, and all that we do is based very much on the data and the science that is out there. And I'm thrilled to be able to bring it to you today. So what to expect? I could talk to you for hours about this topic, but what we're going to do is we're going to try to pack in a lot of good information today in a short time. I'm going to talk briefly about what psychological safety is and give you some of the idea of what we think of it as a concept. We'll talk about why it's important. What does it mean to have psychological safety in your organization? And specifically, how does it impact safety in manufacturing organizations? Because today we're going to be really focusing in on the manufacturing space. That's not to say that it's not very important in all industries, as a matter of fact, but particularly in manufacturing today. We'll talk briefly about what can you do to get more of it. Hopefully by the end of our conversation today, you will be excited and see the value in having more psychological safety. So we'll give you some tips and actions you can take, and we'll give you a few ideas of how you can continue to learn after today's session. So first, I want to hear from you, and you should be able to hold your phone up to the screen using that QR code. And this is Slido if you haven't used it before. It's an easy way for you to give us some input. And I'd love to hear, how much does your organization invest time, energy, and resources into psychological safety? So I'll give you a minute to respond. Seeing a few coming in. So far, we're seeing none at all, moderate focus. So there's a few folks that are focusing on psychological safety. Some folks aren't sure, and that's not uncommon. Oftentimes, if you're unsure, that's probably a good sign that there's not a lot of focus on it. And so, you know what, it's actually very uncommon for us to get the response that there's a significant focus or it's a priority in the organization when we ask this question. And in my opinion, and based on the data we're going to talk about today, I think that's a big problem that organizations have, that so many organizations overlook this very powerful driver of important employee outcomes and workplace safety. So what is psychological safety? What is it? Where does it come from? I know we have a range of folks here. Some of you are probably very familiar with it. Some of you may not have heard anything about it before. So it's been around, this concept's been around for quite some time, but it's been brought to the forefront over the last few years, decade or so, by Amy Edmondson, who we see here. She's written some really great books. We highly recommend them, especially The Fearless Organization, a wonderful, wonderful book. So she's talked a lot about and brought this to the attention of organizations. We won't go down this path today. I think she does a great job of bringing attention to it, but I think she misses the mark in a few ways when she talks about psychological safety, and really that it's she has a strong focus on the importance of psychological safety within a team environment. And while it is critical in a team environment, there is a component of psychological safety in one-on-one relationships with between a leader and their employee. And a leader, as we'll talk about today, is so impactful on whether or not this concept is in place at all, whether people are feeling this. So what psychological safety is, from our perspective, it's the belief that you can be vulnerable. You can open up. You don't have to protect yourself with others in in your workspace, your coworkers, your leaders, other people that you work with, without risk of social consequences, humiliation, or punishment. So this concept goes back to, can I be vulnerable and it won't hurt me? Or do I need to protect myself because I'm fearful that something bad will happen to me? So you might be thinking, wait a minute, you're talking about trust. I've heard about that thing. And yes, there is a connection to trust, but I think it's helpful to understand what the difference is between trust and psychological safety. So trust is actually about how we feel about other people. Can I give them the benefit of the doubt? When I think about another person, can I give them the benefit of the doubt? Whereas psychological safety is really about how other people think about us. So how do I think somebody else will think about me? And that is, will they give me the benefit of the doubt? Now, with the closer we are with someone, the longer we've known them, the more we trust them. We give them the benefit of the doubt because we have a stronger relationship with them. We've had more experience with them. But also, the longer we know someone, the more we feel like they'll give us the benefit of the doubt. They know that we have good intentions and they're going to have our best interests at heart. But ultimately, psychological safety is a perception about how will others react to me. Now, as you think about what that might look like or what that might feel like in the workplace, it can feel like I can stick my neck out. I can say something that maybe others wouldn't say, and I won't be ridiculed. I won't be hurt by this. Or it's feeling like I can speak up and share a different perspective or a mistake that's happened, and it won't be held against me. And all too often, folks don't feel like they can speak up and share a different perspective or a mistake or an error, which can lead to huge problems within the organization. Or feeling like I can be my authentic self, I can be me, and I won't be rejected. So for those of you that are in the HR space, you can probably already see this has a huge tie to whether people feel belongingness. If we don't have psychological safety, we are not going to feel like we can belong or we're included. It feels like I can try something new and fail without being humiliated. I can try something new. So when you have psychological safety, folks feel like it's okay for me to do something that might not work out perfectly, but I'm not going to suffer undue consequences because of this, or I will not have social consequences because of this. Or it will feel like I can make a mistake without being belittled, blamed, or ostracized. It doesn't mean that in an organization that there are no consequences or that it's okay for people to be careless or error prone. But it's that you're not going to face social consequences, that you will not be experiencing undue blame or harsh criticism because you've made an error or a mistake. And I think that it can be easy to maybe think about times where you yourself have experienced some of these potentially in the workplace. But when you've experienced this, then you're far less likely to speak up, take risks, try something new, disagree with a senior leader, for example. All of those things lead to an organization that is shut down, that does not have everybody looking out for the best interests of the organization because they're protecting themselves. So how does psychological safety work exactly? Well, it's all in your head. But I don't mean this as in it's a figment of your imagination. Instead, I mean that there is a strong neurological basis to what happens in psychological safety. So some of you are probably familiar with this concept, but, and we are not going to go through an entire neuroscience conversation today, but I think it's helpful to understand that there is a neurological basis to this experience. We have a pathway in our brains that is referred to as the fear network. And when this network is activated, we have a release of a stress hormone called cortisol, which actually has all sorts of negative effects on our health. But also, we have a natural instinctive reaction to protect ourselves. We say, I am in danger and I need to protect myself and my well-being. Under these conditions, you think of the fight or flight reaction. And when we have the fight reaction, we try to exert power over other people when we're in that sense of a lack of control or fear network. When we are fleeing through the fight or flight response, we protect ourselves, we avoid, we shut down. The other network that we have, the other neurological network that we'll talk about here, is our trust network. And this trust network is actually connected to far more complex parts of our brain. And again, we're not going to go into all the neuroscience of it today, but when we have this trust network activated, we actually have a huge rush of oxytocin, which is a hormone that leads to us feeling bonded to, connected to other people. As a matter of fact, when a woman gives birth, she and the baby will have a huge rush of oxytocin as a bonding chemical to increase that bond between the baby and the mother, for example. But it doesn't just happen in birth. It happens when we have a positive interaction or we have trust between another person. When we feel that trust, when we feel that sense of safety, we are far more likely to be understanding, to want to protect others, to think about the relationship, and we're far more likely to be transparent in our connection and our conversations with others. So when we think about psychological safety as it's tied to the fear versus the trust network, when you have that sense of psychological threat and you feel a sense of fear, what we see in those organizations and from the folks in those organizations is control. I'm afraid, so I'm going to try to control things. So you may see extreme micromanaging. The expectation is compliance at all costs. Even if it isn't the right thing to do, it's comply with what you're being told, or you will be punished. And people are controlled through fear of punishment. In the middle, where you might not think of, you're not in the threat or the fear network. I like to call it the psychological guarded or guard network. It's not necessarily that you have a high level of psychological safety or trust, but it's still not a good thing, because what we see in those organizations is stagnation. Folks are afraid. They're afraid to put themselves out there, to try new things. And so you see organizations that have the status quo in place. Don't rock the boat. There's a lot of complacency in those organizations or teams. And then finally, when we see organizations or teams with psychological safety, when they're on that side of the trust network, these organizations are characterized by a high level of growth. Employees feel empowered because they do feel safe. They're comfortable learning, and so there's much more innovation. All right, so hopefully it's already very clear why psychological safety is important, but now we're going to talk about the numbers, so the stuff I really like. So thinking about why is psychological safety is important, and as I said, today we're going to be really diving into the manufacturing space and workplace safety, so the physical safety, injuries that occur in the workplace. In manufacturing, in 2019 alone, $7.6 billion was spent because of workplace injuries in manufacturing specifically, $7.6 billion. We saw a study, which I think is a great study to look into. So Gallup found that actually 40% fewer safety incidents occurred when there was high psychological safety in an organization or a team. 40%. So going back to this number of 7.6 billion, imagine if we could reduce that number by 40%. That would be huge. And so we at Pixel Leadership Group decided we need to conduct a study because there isn't as much about the connection between psychological safety and workplace safety out there. So this year, actually back in just August of this year, we conducted a national study looking at psychological safety in the workplace. And I'll talk to you briefly about what that sample looked like, but what I really want to do is dive into those numbers. So we were able to survey over 600 workers across the United States, all different industries, really great diverse sample. What you'll see here is that our industry breakdown, we had a third of this group were from manufacturing, a third from healthcare, and a third from other industries. The population that were specific in the manufacturing subset, you can see their demographics here, 75% male. We had 96% were full-time working. The age range is pretty much what you would expect from the manufacturing population, range of organization size. And we had about 54% were managers. And so we did have both management and individual contributor representation. All right, so we started with OSHA. So anybody that's thinking about workplace injuries, workplace safety, OSHA is the place to go. So we asked about OSHA recommended practices. How much do you see these things happening in your organization? And these are this is a sample of some of the things we asked about, and they're based on those practices that OSHA recommends in an organization, such as having a safety manual or ensuring that concerns are documented and action is taken. All seem like great ideas. So in our data, what we found is that when those OSHA practices that I just reviewed are low, you were 1.4 times more likely to have safety incidents. So we specifically are looking at, did safety incidents occur? Did stuff happen? So not the risk of it, but really did it happen? So 1.4 times more likely when you don't have those OSHA recommended practices in place. That's pretty significant when you think about the potential cost of safety incidents. But that's OSHA, that's important. But we know that organizational safety culture has been quite a bit of a focus. So it's about creating a culture that encourages safety in the organization. So we looked at that and we said, okay, how impactful is the organization's safety culture? And some of the things we asked about, you can see here. So is safety prioritized at this organization? Are we continually improving our safety practices? Do we have adequate safety training? So looking at the culture itself. And as you might imagine, the culture itself was more important than just the OSHA recommended practices. Both important, but what we found was that the organizational safety culture, if it was low, you had 2 times more likely to report a safety incident. So twice as many in that low organizational safety culture. So that's a pretty big difference. So we said, okay, let's look at psychological safety. we included our 4 components of psychological safety, which I have listed here. Civility and grace. So this is, are we behaving in a civil manner towards each other and giving each other grace? We don't have to be perfect because nobody is. Can we be vulnerable? And are we comfortable with having some courage to speak up when something is going wrong? Is this a learning environment? Do we encourage growth of our teammates or our employees? And do we trust and support each other? So those are our 4 components that were derived through, for those of you that are the data nerds like me, it was derived through factor analysis. And so we looked at our psychological safety components and, okay. So similar to safety culture, we found that when you have low psychological safety, you were 2 times more likely to have more frequent safety incidents. That's a problem. That's a big problem. We don't want to see that, but maybe psychological safety and safety culture are just the same thing, right? I mean, that's our first thought as the data nerds that we are. So we got to look at it. So what we did then is, in our analyses, we actually looked at how much psychological safety impacted or played a role when you included organizational culture, a safety culture, as well as OSHA practices. What we found was quite interesting. So the impact of OSHA practices, so think back to our OSHA practices, when we include the impact of psychological safety in the analysis, psychological safety is 4 times more powerful than OSHA practices, and OSHA practices are no longer significant. So what that says is that psychological safety is far more powerful, and without it, OSHA practices don't really work. That's pretty huge. But like I said, we were thinking that, maybe safety culture and psychological safety are just the same thing. So we looked at that. And what we found is that the impact of organizational safety culture was no longer significant when we included psychological safety in the analysis. And as a matter of fact, psychological safety was 2 times more impactful than safety culture. So ultimately, what our analyses found, when you're looking at actual safety incidents, problems, things that have happened, so it's not even, do you think it's going to happen? When you look at actual safety incidents, we found that psychological safety is a safety multiplier for your organization. Without the psychological safety in place, your OSHA practices, your organizational cultural efforts, which are very important, but they are not going to be effective, or far less effective, without that psychological safety as a foundation to ensure that they are able to be impactful in the organization. I want to stop there for just a second and check in, and please, as I'm talking, feel free to add any comments or questions into the chat. But does anybody have any questions so far about what I'm sharing with you? I have more, but I want to check in. All right, do jump in, put anything in the chat as we're going along. So let's dive a little bit deeper now into safety and the impact of psychological safety. Now that we know it's important overall, let's understand it a little bit better. So I want you to do another quick survey here. And this one, I want you to think about, for your organization, how important are the safety practices and concerns that are listed? So take just a minute to respond to, there's, I think, 4 of them there. Let's see. All right. So I think we've got quite a few folks have responded. I think there's some folks that are still responding. So employees strictly following safety procedures, as we might expect. It's pretty important. No one so far is saying that it's not important at all in your organization. And I completely understand if you're in the manufacturing space, most likely this is very important. If you're working in an office like I am, it may not be a top focus. Great. So how about the next one? Employees tripping, slipping, and falling. Again, generally very important, somewhat important. No one's saying that that's not important in this group. Great. Safe and careful use of machinery and equipment. That sounds important. I mean, the biggest equipment I have in my office is a copy machine, and it doesn't hurt me that much usually, maybe psychologically, mentally, but not physically. But I can imagine that in the manufacturing space, this is a pretty big deal. And as we're seeing here, for most people, it's very important. And then strictly adhering to the organization's PPE guidelines. So although this was very important for most organizations during COVID, but in manufacturing in particular, this can be an important aspect of safety. A little bit fewer people here than the others for very important. And then our last of the areas we're looking at right now is chemicals, compounds, sprays, aerosols, or liquids. So minimizing exposure to those things. And again, very important. So with knowing that these are very important to most of the organizations that we have here on the call today, let's look at what our data suggested. So looking at being lax about safety procedures. So for those individuals who had lower psychological safety in their organizations and teams, it was 2.7 times more likely that employees were lax about those safety procedures. So they weren't taking them as seriously, they were not necessarily following them. That sounds pretty bad, 2.5 times more likely. Well, slipping, tripping, falling while working, this is actually a huge part of what we see in terms of workers' comp claims is around slipping, tripping, falling. And in those organizations that have lower psychological safety, it's 3 times more likely that this is happening. Machinery being used in careless and unsafe ways, again, lower psychological safety. We saw 3 times more likely that machinery was being used in careless and unsafe ways. How about adhering strictly to the organization's PPE guidelines? I think you probably know the direction that we're headed, but you might be shocked by the number. 14 times less likely to adhere to the PPE guidelines if there is lower psychological safety. 14 times. Imagine the impact that that would have on an organization's bottom line, because if folks aren't following these, there is a reason these guidelines are in place. And if folks are not following them, it is certainly going to lead to greater safety concerns. And then finally, this one I think was the biggest shock for me, exposures to chemicals, aerosols, etc. 27 times more unsafe conditions when you have low psychological safety, 27 times more unsafe. So huge impacts when we see that there is a low psychological safety environment. And I see that we have maybe some questions or comments coming through. I don't know if Rebecca, you've had a chance to.
Yeah, a great comment from Shanna that she likes the tie-in of psych safety to culture. She's found that there's high psych safety in organizations that have a great safety culture.
Yes.
And her follow-up question is, what is the best tool to use to assess an organization's level of psych safety? Is it just your education that increases the psych safety?
We're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about what you can do in your organization in just a little bit, some tips and strategies. And I think the best tool is ours because I'm biased, but certainly measuring your psychological safety knowing where you're at, getting data and information in order to make good decisions about how to intervene and where to take action is really important. Great. So before we talk, those are some safety numbers. Before we talk about some of those actions you can take, I just want to share some other really impactful data around psychological safety, because there is more. Psychological safety is critical for the physical safety, for the workplace safety, but it impacts other things as well. You may know, if you're in manufacturing, you're probably feeling it every single day, that 9 out of 10 manufacturers are currently struggling to close their labor gaps. And there's a reason for that. Those of you maybe have seen this, this chart. This is from SHRM, actually put this out. And this is looking at the quit rates over the decades, over the last 20 years. And what you'll notice, that orange line here is actually 2021. And that is a huge increase. Folks have been quitting at an unbelievable rate. We all have probably been hearing about it in the social media and in the news, not just the quiet quitters, but the Great Resignation. But it's a very real thing that is happening in manufacturing alone. This is not just a 2021 a pandemic situation, because we're looking at a likely huge gap going forward, and it's going to get bigger. Right now, there's about 1 million job gap for manufacturing. It's projected to, or I think it's 500,000, sorry, right now, but it's projected to get to 2 million by 2030. So 2 million jobs that will not have a person to fill them by 2030. Thank you. And so this is a problem. Organizations have to address the fact that we are going to see a huge shift in how we work with our employees and how we fill our positions, if we can. So what we know is that low psychological safety has a huge impact on turnover. What we found in our study is that individuals who were in a low psychological safety organization or team were 11 times less committed to that organization or staying there. They had 4 times they were 4 times more likely to want to leave that organization or be planning to leave. So 4 times higher turnover intention. And a study by Accenture said that if you increase psychological safety, you will see more than 25%, so about 27% reduction in turnover in your organization. So turnover is highly related to whether people feel psychologically safe. And if we go back to what we said before, if you feel like you can be yourself and you can speak up and you can learn and take risks, you're going to be in a place where you feel much more comfortable and satisfied. So what do we know about why people are leaving? Well, they are more disengaged and dissatisfied. We have seen that low psychological safety leads to lower dissatisfaction. So, higher dissatisfaction, they're more dissatisfied. So 5.5 times more dissatisfied. They are 10 times, if you're in a low psychological safety environment, you are 10 times more likely to be disengaged. That's huge. And anybody that's in that disengagement space or that space of understanding employee engagement, disengagement costs a lot of money. For every $10,000 of salary of a disengaged employee, it costs about $3,000 or so dollars. So you're spending money to have disengaged employees.
We had a couple of chats that are along those lines. One, that psychological safety ties in very well with the Total Worker Health Initiative.
Yes.
And then Allie commented that she appreciates this level of granularity in the measurement and analysis approach. I contemplate the ripple effects of these safety behaviors, how disruptive it is to an employee's identity, family life, and beyond when visible and invisible injuries occur. It matters so much that organizational leaders, all organization members for that matter, understand the impact of psych safety and make moves to maintain it.
Absolutely. And there are huge ripple effects. The psychological safety does directly impact employees' well-being, their mental health, their level of stress, all of those things are impacted. And as Ali said, there are certainly ripple effects outside of the workplace then. If you're feeling this sense of guardedness and you don't feel safe in your workplace, it is certainly in that level of increased stress, and the impact on your well-being is going to impact how you're feeling outside of the workplace. Absolutely.
Thanks for those.
Yeah, I love the comments. Keep them coming. So in those numbers in 2021, we saw huge changes, folks leaving their jobs, but many, and again, in the media, a lot was about pay, and pay is important. So we don't want to suggest that folks don't deserve higher paychecks, because they do. But that's not the reason that they're leaving. That only 10% of folks left because of pay in 2021. There's been a huge shift in the reasons that people are leaving since the pandemic in particular. McKinsey every year actually looks at attrition across the United States. And in their study in 2021, they found there were 3 top reasons for people leaving. Number 1 is that they did not feel valued by their company. Number 2 was their manager. And number 3, they lacked a sense of belonging. So didn't feel valued, their manager and the way that their manager interacted with them, and they didn't feel a sense of belonging. Well, what we know about psychological safety, having high psychological safety, individuals feel more valued, 3.5 times more valued, 2 times higher belonging when you have higher psychological safety. You see almost 1.7 times discretionary effort, which we all want people to go above and beyond to give their all to their job. And that leads to higher productivity, as again, every organization wants to see the most productivity they can out of their employees. So we see 2 times more productivity when you have that high psychological safety environment. It also affects other things that organizations care about. It improves quality of products. The quality is increased by 30%. There's a 30% difference from a low psychological safety versus a high psychological safety team or organization. 30%. I mean, that's a big difference in the quality of your product. Yeah. Was there a comment? Okay. And I find this just wonderfully fascinating and something that needs to be researched far more. There was a great study that we came across that was published just, I think, in December of last year, so 2021. And it found a strong relationship in the psychological safety within organizations and supply chain operations, and how the relationship across suppliers and the organizations they supplied to, how strong that was. And so because of that study, we wanted to look at it in our study as well, just to understand it a little bit better. Would we find a similar pattern? And we did. There was a 35% difference between that high versus the low psychological safety organizations in their supply chain operations. So worse supply chain operations when you had lower psychological safety. There's a lot more to study and understand there, because that is fascinating. And as we all know, the supply chain has been a big part of what's been happening over the last couple of years. And how we feel it every day when we're at the grocery store and so forth. And these results, we're sharing our results with you. Our results are very much in line with what others are finding out there. So these are not outrageous, but it's just confirming what much of the research says. A very well-known study, the 2-year project Aristotle that Google did, and you may have read about this, they found the one thing in common across all their highest performing teams was psychological safety. It was the most impactful thing for team performance at Google. And so this has been replicated over and over by other researchers and organizations since. And some other benefits that we see to teams when you do have that high psychological safety, all things that most organizations want. They're more inclusive, they're more innovative, more resilient, and more agile. Who wouldn't want those things? And in case all of that wasn't enough, psychological safety impacts profits. So for those organizations that want that bottom line number, they want to know that this is going to impact those profits. It does. Great Place to Work found that psychological safety was the biggest driver of earnings. Huge, huge statement right there. All right, so we've gone through some of the data, some really impactful numbers. What can you do to get more of it? I'm sure you would like to have more of it in your organizations. I like this quote by Professor Dame Carol Black. And she said, if you want a highly engaged, productive, and happy workforce, then you have to invest in your people, which is absolutely the truth. And I don't think anybody on here will be surprised by that. But you've got to create a psychologically safe culture, and it has to start with your managers, your executives, your leadership, and it has to permeate the institution. It is critical for the leaders in the organization to lead the way when it comes to creating psychological safety. Psychological safety, in my opinion, must be a strategic imperative for every organization. By neglecting psychological safety, you can see all of the ripple effects that you experience in your organization, both in safety, productivity, profits. And as we saw in that comment from Carol Black, and Amy Edmondson herself also mentioned that the most important influence is the nearest manager, supervisor, or boss. So it is very important for an organization to have a culture of psychological safety. There are organizational characteristics of the culture, behaviors, reinforcers, policies, procedures, all sorts of aspects of an organization's culture that can either encourage or discourage psychological safety. But ultimately, whether an individual employee feels psychological safety or not, the most important influence is that direct manager. And because we aren't going to just take Amy Edmondson's comment, we need to look at the data. And so what we did is in our data, we looked at how important was the manager, the individual's direct supervisor, and we found that the manager accounted for 60% of the variance of psychological safety. So for those of you that are not stats nerds like us, that's amazing. To get to a place of 60% of the variance when we're talking about anything that's psychological is huge. So the manager is, so from an organizational standpoint, as somebody who really wants to help organizations to do better, be better, to create better environments for their employees, this is the place to focus. If you can help your managers to create psychological safety, all of these other great things will happen for your organization. But on the flip side, if those managers are creating environments that are not psychologically safe, we see all the downsides of that as well. So how can you create a psychologically safe workplace? And these are our recommendations based on what the data says out there, what the research suggests. Number one, focus on your organization's culture, and we'll talk about some things you can do there. Number two, and actually I'd say this is the most important of all, if you're going to pick one of these, pick this one. Develop your managers to cultivate psychological safety. And number three, collect data and take action. Very few organizations are collecting data to understand the psychological safety environment of their organization, which is shocking to me, given how impactful it is to all the things that organizations care about. So a few suggestions, tips, things that we know will help in the organization's culture. Really looking to create a zero tolerance policy of disrespectful and incivil behaviors. So incivility, a lack of civility, disrespectful behaviors are the number one cause of low. So they if you have an environment that is disrespectful and incivil, it's almost impossible to have an environment of psychological safety. And so this is something that, as an organization, making this an important priority is key. Make asking and listening to opinions, asking for, I want to hear from you, and I want to listen to you, and I want to take action based on what you are saying to me. Make that the norm of the organization. So many organizations, it isn't the norm. The norm is we got to get things done as fast as possible, or as cheap as possible, or we have to fall in line in our organization's hierarchy. We don't ask for our employees' opinions. What do they know? So ask, listen is critical. Create an environment of continuous feedback. The more that feedback is occurring, people know that it's a part of the way that we do things here. We give each other input. We give each other feedback. There aren't negative ramifications for doing so. It becomes part of the norm and how we engage with each other. Reward those people who speak up. Actually, let them know that that is a valued thing in the organization. And embrace failure as a part of learning. So taking a growth mindset approach, saying that failures are a part of how we continue to grow as an organization. So developing your managers to cultivate psychological safety. Most of us don't know naturally how to do these things. A few of us are lucky. We're given the genetic material, maybe, that we have the personality that it's easy for us to do this, but most people are not born with these skills. And yet organizations are shocked when their managers are not creating the conditions that they want to see for their employees. So critical, invest in your manager skills, particularly when it comes to psychological safety and helping them build more psychological safety. I strongly encourage, provide them coaching. Help those managers understand how to change their behaviors in a way that will cultivate psychological safety. The number one, so it's helpful for the managers to have a coach to help them to change. But in terms of the skill set to help them develop, coaching, and if you guys want to join me another time, I'll give you all the great data about coaching skills for managers. But oh my gosh, I don't know how we're not all spending all of our money on helping managers to do this, because coaching skills for managers are so impactful in terms of building psychological safety, employee engagement, satisfaction, all this good stuff we want. So investing in helping your managers to coach is so impactful. Increasing their self-awareness as much as you can, because the more that they understand what's driving them, how they're behaving, the better that they'll be able to adjust to those ways of behaving that increase psychological safety. High value meeting skills. So, I can't see all of you right now, but if I were to ask, how many of you, we're a biased group because most folks here are in HR, but most individuals have not learned how to have a good meeting. What creates a high value meeting? And believe it or not, this is important for psychological safety, both in terms of ensuring that folks feel like they have a voice in a meeting, but that there aren't even inadvertent messages or actions happening in a meeting that discourage people from speaking up and feeling included. Teaching your managers how to express caring. That was one of the most impactful things a manager could do to increase psychological safety. Express caring, listening to their employees. Again, many people don't know this naturally. Some other skills that managers that we know are tied to increasing psychological safety, managers learning how to foster collaboration. How do you create a collaborative environment within the team that you're leading? How do you encourage collaboration across the folks on your team? How do you give and receive feedback in a way?
So we had a couple comments that are germane to that
Go
topic.
ahead.
Benita added that she'll add that managers that ask for feedback from their reports, especially on how they can improve and actually act on it, as a powerful behavioral walk the walk that increases psych safety.
Yes.
Then Shanna added 360 performance reviews. And Benita said she totally agrees, but most organizations don't have this for their upper leadership.
That is true. So the upper leadership, the senior leadership need to walk the talk as well. They need to role model all of these things. Like I said, the whole organizational culture can affect psychological safety. But the good news is, even if the organizational culture isn't where you want it to be, an individual manager can have a huge impact on the folks that they directly lead. And so absolutely 360 feedback is so valuable. If you want to sometime talk to me offline though, Shanna, I will say that doing it in a way that's very safe and developmental in nature is critical, so that it doesn't actually decrease psychological safety, because we hear often that organizations aren't doing it maybe in line with best practices, and actually then it backfires in terms of psychological safety. Some other skills: teaching your managers how to facilitate conversation, and how do you help your team to have productive conflict. Because within a team, when we have destructive conflict, or we don't allow space for conversation and connection in our conversation, it reduces psychological safety. And then measure and hold them accountable. Measure and hold your managers accountable. If they are not creating psychological safety on their teams, give them the skills, give them the opportunity, give them the support and caring, and listen to them, but also hold them accountable. We can't let jerks continue to lead. So then last of the 3 actions before we talk about how do you continue learning: collect that data. I was just saying, collect, measure data, measure your managers, how they're doing around this. Keep your finger on a pulse of the employee experience. Make sure that what you're asking in your annual employee survey is including psychological safety. How are they feeling about their manager? Are they thriving? Managers, all leaders having regular 360 developmental 360s where they can get feedback in a safe way that they can use to make change about their behavior is very impactful. And conducting regular pulse checks around that data. All right, so a couple of ways that you can continue learning from here. Here are some of our favorite books around psychological safety. We'll give you, if you want the slide deck, which is here, if you want the slide deck, you can put it in the chat or in our survey, our feedback survey we're going to give you in just a second. We'll send you the slide deck. You can get these, or you can take a screenshot. Pixel has a psychological safety amplifier coaching program, which is actually relatively new, that we have built off of some other science-backed, data-driven coaching programs that we already offer. But those of you that are here today, we're going to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to include yourself or some of your managers in the pilot of this. We have some going now. It's a great program. We're getting great feedback, but we're going to give you that opportunity. Again, if you're interested in learning more about that, reach out to us after today or note it in the comments. We have a few master classes. So some of you on here today have been to some of our master classes, I think already, but particularly these master classes focus specifically on the skills that we know help managers generate psychological safety, that help them to build employee engagement and retention. You can see in February specifically, we have a session targeted on psychological safety. And for those of you here, you have a discount code that is on the screen that you can use to join any of these for free. And as I mentioned, if you want those slides or to learn more, reach out. So I'm going to ask you all for a favor. In these next couple of minutes, I know we have about 3 minutes left. I really would love your feedback about this session. As we said, this is our first workplace science explained session. So we really want that feedback so we know how to change or adjust to continue to offer high value content to the folks that we love out there. And while we're doing this, I also would love to answer any questions that you have or hear any comments.
Hey, Jamie, I have a question for you.
Yes.
And I think it is well timed, your presentation, when you look at the overall dynamics in the market with the tech sector, right, in terms of their,
Yes.
I'm trying to be polite here, in terms of the approach they've taken, right, facing kind of financially challenging climate. And so the question I have for you is, in that climate, at a company that has to figure out how to balance that financial metric, because, you know, if you're a for-profit company, if you don't make money, you're not going to be employing anybody, right? But also with mass layoffs that are often the go-to instead of the last thing that you do, how do you maintain psychological safety? Because it's very difficult, right, for employees when they're seeing that sort of environment. They're very fearful. How in an organization like that, how do you do that in a way that is the right way, so that you can maintain that overall psychological safety, which is going to be critical, even more critical, I would argue, during a tough economic climate for a company?
I have so many things I want to say to that, Benita. First off, I do believe that psychological safety and looking to increase employee engagement are going to be critical in this upcoming environment that we will likely be facing. And so organizations should be doubling down in their efforts to really build up the culture and the managers that they have to keep and engage the employees that they have. So talking about the layoffs or reductions in force, you know, I think that under the best circumstances, organizations would choose other ways of cutting back. And there are some really well-known stories of organizations that did choose other ways and said, we aren't going to cut people, we'll cut other things first. Not that every organization has that opportunity. I know of organizations who are doing everything they can. If they cannot keep all their people, they're doing everything they can to show that they care about them, to try to help them find another place to land. So much of this has to do with that sense of caring, and are you looking to show them that you really want to do what's best for them if you can. But I do think as an organization, it's important to realize that if you do that, if you have layoffs, it can have a ripple effect in terms of how the employees that are left are going to feel, and they're not going to feel as safe. So I think that's a great question, and something that maybe we can go into more in a future session. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and just want to say thank you. I know we're at time. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any other questions, but thank you so much. We really do appreciate your time today. And again, I'll stick around if you have any other questions.